Alrighty, my name's Andrew Lopez, and our team is doing a presentation on the history of Nintendo. So, a lot of Nintendo's recent history is already pretty well known. So, our group wanted to focus on kind of the origins of Nintendo and kind of some of their older history before the turn of the century. So, we're going to be starting. Before we actually get into the kind of company of Nintendo, we want to start with some historical context because that's kind of relevant to kind of the company of Nintendo and its success later on. So at the time, in the late 1800s, when Nintendo was founded, Japan was kind of in the midst of a transitionary period known as the Meiji era. So during this time, Japan was undergoing a bunch of radical political, economic, and cultural changes that were kind of sweeping across the country and kind of rapidly changing kind of the landscape of Japan. And so this all kind of started with a coup against the leader at the time, a shogun, who was essentially an authoritative ruler. So he was overthrown, and this brought about a bunch of change across Japan, including rapid industrialization, a changing of the capital to Tokyo, and a kind of introduction of Western culture and values in Japan. So, ideas like capitalism and democracy and kind of entrepreneurship were starting to become prevalent in Japanese society. So, this is the kind of context in which Fusajiro Yamauchi first founds Nintendo in 1889. And it might come as a surprise to some of you that Nintendo wasn't founded as a game company, really. It was founded as a kind of card making company that produced Hanafuda cards, which are these kind of traditional Japanese playing cards that you see in the bottom left corner here. And so for a long time, this was Nintendo's like primary business venture. They just produced Hanafuda cards, and eventually they would go into making normal Western playing cards that you can see in the center picture. But this is essentially all that they did for a while until in 1949 when Yamauchi's ancestor Hiroshi Yamauchi takes over the company and begins to change kind of its direction. So he begins to kind of modernize the country and kind of drive it beyond just making cards and into making toys and eventually video games, arcade machines. So this all kind of starts with kind of the president's approach to Disney to acquire licensing rights to produce toys and other Disney paraphernalia.
Following President Yamauchi's trip to America and his newfound vision for the company, Nintendo was ready to step up. They were about to enter a period of distribution, production, and expansion as they moved from cards to toys to video games. Their distribution was helped by the fact that President Sekiro, former president, had set up a distribution network in the early 1900s, and this helped Nintendo really jump into the toy industry. Their production was helped by Gunpei Yokoi, who was a young maintenance worker, and President Yamauchi saw potential in his ideas. Some of them are pictured here. There's the Love Tester, which is on the bottom left of his picture, and the first one, which actually pioneered Nintendo jumping into the toy business, was the Ultra Hand, which was an extendable arm that Yokoi had actually made for personal use, and then they decided to make it into a toy, and it was pretty successful. And as they expanded, they made kind of a ripoff of Space Invaders. It was called Radar Scope, and it was pretty popular in Japan. And Yokoi also he had ideas for the handheld Game and Watch, which was kind of like one of the first like kind of portable game machines, which you could play games on. And yeah, it was pretty successful. Nintendo continued to expand it. They expanded into America in the very early 80s. It started in Elizabeth, New Jersey, but they eventually moved to Seattle. When they first got to America, they tried to sell Radar Scope because it was pretty successful in Japan, but people didn't really buy into it because they already had Space Invaders and they were more into like Namco and Atari games at this point in time. When they tried to sell Radar Scope, they had a bunch of unsold cabinets left, and they had really only broke even. So what President Yamauchi did is he looked inside of the company to try and find inspiration for new ideas, and he ends up finding Shigeru Miyamoto and teams him up with Yokoi, who made the Game and Watch and was making the toys. and they come up with this idea for this game, Donkey Kong, and it ends up being pretty successful. And they actually end up getting sued later by Universal because Universal tried to say it was too much like King Kong, but John Kirby, their lawyer, comes in and pretty much destroys Universal, and that was that. All right, Nintendo changes the game. So in Japan, they had released this home console called the Nintendo Family Computer, or the Famicom, where you could play arcade games at your house. And that was pretty cool. There wasn't a lot of things like that in Japan during this time. But as we'll see later in America, things were much different. Here we're moving into America. They couldn't release the Famicom at the same time because the video game market had actually crashed during the early 80s. There were too many consoles and too many games of varying quality, and it was kind of just like anyone could make any video game. And people were kind of sick of it because they had to pay a lot of money for the consoles, but the games weren't there wasn't quality control. So what they did with the NES was they changed the paint job, they changed everything to try and fit America, what the culture and society were kind of going for at that time. And they had actually partnered it with a toy, the Rob. It's kind of like a buddy you could play with. You could give him a controller and he'd play with you. People didn't really buy into that, but they did buy into the NES a couple years after the market crash. The first ones were selling in New York, and they sold pretty well, so Nintendo started selling more of them. Here we have just some NES accessories that they had. We have the Power Glove. The Rob is seen on this array of NES accessories. The NES Zapper too. You could use that. It was kind of like a gun that you could point around, a gun controller. You could use to play games on your home console. But the idea here is Nintendo was full of ideas and they were trying out all of them. No idea was too small or too silly to try out. They just went for it on every occasion. Sometimes they failed and sometimes they were pretty big successes. 70%. This is the amount of the market share in North America Nintendo had in the video game industry by 1988, which relates to $2.3 billion in revenue, which is pretty cool. They were also the only ones selling consoles in America up until this point, or at least like the big name consoles. And we'll see once other big names start making consoles and getting into the industry, it's going to get a little rough for Nintendo for a little bit.
Section 4. The Console Wars. Starting off with the SNES release in America, this console was released in 1991 and was the second-bit generation console to hit the market, the first being the Sega Genesis. 16-bit consoles had significantly more processing power that allowed them to render and play much more intense games. Graphics also improved steadily during this time as well. At this point in Nintendo's lifetime, they were still the only company who had a review system that only allowed quality games to be played on their console due to the fact that they wanted to market towards families. Nintendo also had a strict violence and gore review system that later became the Entertainment Software Rating Board's ESRB. After this organization was created, Nintendo's review of violence and gore was halted. As stated in the previous slide, the Sega Genesis was the first 16-bit console released in America, which gave it an edge over the SNES due to its late release. Sega, however, marketed heavily towards an older teenage audience, as opposed to Nintendo, who wanted to make family-friendly games. The SNES, however, sold much more than the Genesis, due to the fact that Nintendo had huge titles on it, like Street Fighter II and Donkey Kong Country, which both revolutionized the game genres they were in. After destroying Sega in the console wars, Nintendo had a big idea planned for the next release. This was the first ever virtual reality gaming system, called the Virtual Boy. This product was a huge flop, only ever selling 770,000 units. Issues with the console included the graphics being in all red, and the console also giving its user massive headaches for long periods of use. Nintendo gave up on virtual reality idea quickly after they saw how little units were being sold. However, this system reveals that Nintendo's ability to innovate and constantly create intriguing new ideas for altering gameplay in a way never thought of before, and they never gave up on this philosophy, despite the failures that might come with it. Here are the years that consoles were released over time. That shows the fall of Sega and the rise of Sony and Microsoft, exemplifying how Nintendo dominated Sega in the console wars, which allowed for newer companies at that time to try and compete against the gaming giant that was Nintendo.
The last part we wanted to go over today was just an overview of Nintendo's success. We had some important takeaways from Nintendo's journey over the years. They never let the fear of failure prevent them from trying something new or risky. This was seen in a lot of the places where President Yamauchi would get his ideas from. He got them from a young maintenance worker, just turning inside of the company to find Miyamoto and just pairing these people up. Um, no idea was ever too risky. They tried the Virtual Boy, it didn't work out. Um, they were very goal oriented in everything they did. They really wanted to be there for the customer. They were trying to really just be a good entertainment company, and they really succeeded, as we can see. Um, Here I wrote, "Be persistent, not stubborn." This was kind of seen with the GameCube. It took a really long time for Nintendo to switch over to discs over cartridges, and this really upset a lot of third-party developers and gamers because the discs could hold more like larger games than the cartridges, and games were starting to expand and enhance and get better. And Nintendo was kind of left in the dust for a little bit. And even when they did switch to discs with the GameCube, they were smaller proprietary ones, which was just annoying to work with. And the last one, they were very open to hearing ideas from anyone and everyone. No idea was ever too small or too silly to try. And this is just seen with all of Nintendo's like new ideas that we've seen over the years. The 3DS, the Wii with motion controls and everything. Um, some people would have called it crazy, but Nintendo decided to try it out and worked out pretty well.